that visualise sound waves in music, to fancy heat pipe based desk lamps and even a decent sounding headset microphone. But with so many things to cover, one last important project couldn't be fitted in. You see, look at this poor laptop. It's been completely smashed, the screen doesn't work, there's a horrible bend in the side here. I mean, goodness knows what actually happened to it. But it's essentially unusable, as you can see. But remarkably, if I plug in an external monitor, the system does appear to still be working. Now this is, I think, quite amazing considering the damage, but really replacing the screen and trying to repair it is just not worth it because the plastics are bent and broken, and I think that we can do something a bit better than that. So what I'm going to do is, as the specs in this are still reasonable even by today's standards, I'm going to actually dismantle it and use it to show you how to build your very own all-in-one PC with a beautiful modern design. Now this will have all of the components built into it to make it a fully functional independent PC, including an absolutely phenomenal sound system. And it should be a fantastic use of an old smashed up laptop. So let's get to it. So to build an all-in-one PC out of a laptop, the first thing to do is strip down the laptop in an effort to remove the motherboard. This isn't particularly difficult, and like is the case here, often starts with the keyboard. I'm going to keep this to one side though, as it's going to be important later on. One by one, the plastics can be separated and removed as well, and all of the cables unclipped as you progress. With that done, you should now be left with the motherboard tray. If you look closely at mine, you can see the damage inflicted on it, and amazingly it appears as though it's only the heatsink and fan that are bent, with the PCB itself having had a very fortunate escape. Bending it back into position though reveals that one of the heat pipes has collapsed, which will definitely harm its cooling ability, and could mean that the fan itself will always run at maximum speed as it tries to compensate. Thankfully though, there are plenty of spares available on eBay for this particular laptop model, which is easy enough to swap out. So at this stage it's important to check whether the system can operate outside its casing like this, and the first challenge for me is actually going to be turning it on. You see, unlike most laptops, the power button on mine is actually part of the keyboard membrane itself, and cannot be separated. This poses a potential problem as I don't really want to leave this keyboard connected, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Another potential issue, for everyone this time, is that without power on with AC attach, which may help me to still boot this while ditching the keyboard, but we'll see if that's possible later. Machines. As it didn't have any USB 3.0 ports though, I slid in a USB 3.0 expansion card that I had lying around, and also added a SATA SSD for the operating system storage. These upgrades should ensure that the system runs smoothly, and we'll assess its performance later on in the video.
Opera GX Browser is the world's first browser for gamers. It's a tailored browser for gamers like you and me, with cool features like...
So, with the motherboard now checked and upgraded, it's time to really get going on this project, starting with a very important decision as to what monitor to build it into. Originally, I was just going to use this old Dell, which, while it is a good monitor with good colour accuracy, it's awfully big and bulky, and will only be made even more bulky as we add more components to it. I want this build to be as sleek as possible, so instead I've decided to go with a low-cost, slimline monitor, which will not only make the build much easier to put together thanks to the flat back, but it should also look very professional once completed due to the design we'll be using. So to get things going, we're going to mount all of the components onto a single piece of MDF wood, that will then be mounted on the back of the display. You might think that this is a rather unusual material to use here, especially in an area where you can easily order aluminium sheeting, but I'll go through my reasoning for recommending it as we progress. So the first task is to mark the motherboard mounting holes onto this MDF, and drill these out with an appropriate drill bit. The underside of these holes can then be countersunk so that the heads of the screws we'll be using can be flush with the surface, meaning that they won't be in the way when it gets mounted to the back of the monitor. This is actually the first reason why MDF is a good choice here, as its thickness allows screws to be countersunk like this. These screws are actually for mounting some PCB pillars to support the motherboard, but before adding all of them, I, purely for aesthetic reasons, added some vinyl wrap to the MDF, which makes it look quite smart for this video presentation. The pillars can now be added and the motherboard screwed in place on top of them. This brings me to the second reason for choosing MDF, which is that it's actually a great material to glue other woods to, allowing us to simply glue in place some pine edging to function as the outer perimeter. This is an unusual material to use for a computer, but I think it will look rather nice once it's on the back of the screen. So before gluing on the rest of the edging, it's a good point in time to add any additional components and wires, like say the monitor cable, and in my case a USB 3.0 hub and card reader, so that these can be accessed on the side of the case. Any holes and slots for things like this can be cut in the side edging before they too get stuck in place. Now to get the angled corners so that they fit together at 90 degrees, I suggest using a miter saw. Now some of you eagle-eyed viewers will have probably noticed that I've included the laptop's battery here, and I'll explain the reasoning behind this later. So with most of the major components now mounted in place, we need to tackle something quite important for an all-in-one PC, which is the audio. As the laptop's original speakers are unusually abysmal, and the ones built into the monitor aren't much better, I'm going to experiment with using some integrated speakers that I salvaged from an old TV. Big shout out to Bob Trade for this, as they gave me the TV. Thanks guys! What's quite exciting about these is that they appear to be completely enclosed units designed by Harman Kardon and JBL, so I have high hopes for their sound quality. To prevent damage to the main drivers by, say, stray fingers, I glued in place a thin mesh to the front, and then added some thin fabric for appearances, which I kept in place with a little 3D printed border. These units could then be glued to the monitor at a downwards angle to project the sound waves underneath and forwards towards the listener. These look reasonably presentable from the front, and should provide excellent clarity. The subwoofer, on the other hand, can be mounted in the rear casing, as bass frequencies pass around objects more easily, so it doesn't matter that it's on the back here. With these speakers being pretty powerful, an amplifier needs to be used to get the most out of them. In my case, a stereo one was just fine because the speaker drivers themselves have crossover filters built in, as well as a mono mix for the subwoofer. Connecting it to the laptop's headphone port, I encountered two problems during testing however. The first is that it turns out that the audio quality from the headphone port on the laptop is very poor, with thin bass and grating treble. And the second is that because I'm powering the amplifier from the same power source that the laptop is running off, there's an inescapable interference noise that sounds awful, caused by what's known as a ground loop. To get around both of these sound issues, I bought a USB power isolator as well as a USB audio interface. Despite its price, this USB audio interface sounds much better than the laptop's original output, and because it receives its power through the isolator, which creates a new virtual ground, the ground loop is eliminated and the interference noise completely disappears. This results in extremely clean and clear audio, and I'll give you an example